Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today, as we move from Game Week 3 to Game Week 4, we look at the top 5 questions for the game week. It's going to be what to do with Haaland, time to move off Leicester double goalkeepers, Rodrigo, Perisic, or Toney, the last chance for Liverpool assets, and what to do with the 8.0 mids. The first question is what to do with Haaland. Earlier on this week, Pep actually mentioned that Haaland will not be playing when there are games every 3 days. We already have a friendly with Barcelona, but I think Haaland won't be participating in it. So the most likely opportunity for Haaland to miss a game is game week 5 versus Nottingham Forest when City are actually playing at home. And that's probably one of the best fixtures on paper for Haaland. But if he doesn't start that game, it becomes an interesting opportunity to think about whether we should actually rotate out of Haaland. And for me, there are actually 3 options to play around this. Simply put, game week 4, there's no reason if you're a current Haaland owner to not play him versus Crystal Palace. I think he's not going to play versus Barcelona in the friendly. We'll wait and see what happens there. I imagine he'll actually allow Julian Alvarez to play over Haaland, and Haaland will get the full-on rest so that he can play in the weekend. That will allow him to play versus Crystal Palace. And then at game week 5, you have an option to think about. If you're able to roll the transfer this week, the opportunity to move into game week 5 with KDB, with 2 free transfers, is a likely opportunity to go into the double premium midfielders. KDB so far has performed on par with Haaland, in my opinion, and he does stand to be a great captaincy option versus Nottingham Forest if we know he's going to start and if we know Haaland's going to be rotated. And that will probably be determined by whether he actually plays the Crystal Palace game. Now, obviously, deciding to roll now, you won't actually have the full information. So rolling will actually be a little bit of a guesstimate towards Haaland being rotating game week 5 if you'd like to opt for this strategy. At the same time, saving a free transfer is always a good option sometimes. We're early in the season, things can happen, and you might want to move and save those 2 free transfers for other options. But KDB is a great option to move into, especially with Toney. Toney unfortunately does play versus Crystal Palace, but he's still the best forward in my opinion if you're moving away from one of the 8.0 midfielders to go into one of the forwards, because Mitrovic has much tougher games than Toney leading up to game week 9. So that's a great opportunity for people to wildcard, and at that time you could probably move from Toney to Mitrovic. The alternative option is to keep, and this will actually lead you towards 2 strands in terms of directions. By game week 6, you could actually play Kane versus Fulham. Kane versus Fulham is probably the best fixture on paper to captain. He might even be better as a captain option than Salah and Haaland. So that's a great opportunity to actually keep Haaland versus Nottingham Forest. See what happens. Hope that he gets a return even if he's coming off the bench, and then move into Kane as the best captaincy option in game week 6. Simply because Kane has West Ham away in game week 5, which doesn't seem super exciting. You could obviously go for Kane a little bit earlier, but I just like the Nottingham fixture more. They've been a worse defense, and simply put, I prefer the home fixture versus the away fixture. When we compare Haaland, though, it might even be an option to simply keep him even through the midweek games because he looks so interesting on paper. Even though he's been rested quite early in games, he still is leading the league in a lot of key areas and a lot of key stats, which will suggest he'll probably outperform most players on points and still get a lot of bonus points and some crazy weeks where we'll see probably braces and even hat-tricks in the future. He leads the league in expected goals. He also leads them in non-penalty expected goals, and that's key because we saw him get a penalty earlier on in the season already, and that's a great sign because Mahrez wasn't actually taking that penalty. Expected goals per 90 is another key stat too. He's second in that stat, and then with shots, he's third behind Mitrovic and Rodrigo. At this moment in time, I'd probably say Haaland is still the best forward option in the game, and there's no reason to move away from him. So I'm probably going to trend towards actually keeping him through all these fixtures, and maybe thinking about moving to Kane in game week 6, because that might be just a bit of a better option, as Kane could be a great captaincy shout then. The second question is whether to move off the double Leicester goalkeepers. This doesn't apply if you have Ward on your bench and you have a goalkeeper from another team starting, but this applies to people who started with Ward and Iverson. Simply put, Leicester have been pretty terrible with Ward as a starting keeper. Goals conceded and save percentage finds them at the bottom of the table. Ward has already made significant errors, one of them being in the Arsenal game, and the shots on target haven't been necessarily super high for Leicester, but the fact that they've conceded 8 goals from 11 shots and the save percentage is at the bottom of the table already suggests you have the makings of one of the worst keepers in the league at this moment in time. And simply put, I think the best replacement is to move into Sanchez, get that money back and make a transfer. You probably would have rolled in game weeks 2 or 3, and this is a great opportunity now to move into someone like Sanchez, who's really, really good fixtures. And Brighton have already posted good statistics so far, ranking around 3rd in the league when it comes to expected goals against, and that's a huge upgrade from Ward, and Iverson, who are probably on a trajectory to provide continuing 1 points, given that the next 3 fixtures are Chelsea away, Man United at home, and Brighton away. Question 3 is about Rodrigo, Perisic, or Toney. And the interesting thing here, obviously, is Toney is much more expensive. What I would say is that if you are wildcarding, Toney is a fantastic option because he gets to play versus Everton in game week 4. Otherwise, you might find it really hard to move into Toney now, and I'd probably move away from that transfer and think about it much later, or even avoid it and go for Mitrovic later on if you're wildcarding around game week 8. The most interesting options for me in the short term are actually going to be Perisic and Rodrigo. The reason why is because they're pretty similar on expected points when it comes to projections for expected assists per 90, whereas Rodrigo is 6th in the league for expected goals per 90 himself. Rodrigo is actually slowly getting more minutes, and Perisic is as well too because he's slowly building up his fitness. The one thing though is Perisic probably is sometimes subject to not starting. Ryan Sessegnon could definitely play in the midweek games, and that would definitely affect Perisic's, I guess, utility as an asset and whether you actually want to spend that sort of money on someone who could be rotated and not start. However, we saw the explosive ceiling that he provided, and he is still ultimately a little bit more interesting than some other assets if you are chasing that upside compared to players like Ruben Dias, who got 2 clean sheets in game weeks 1 and 2, but then ultimately got outscored by Perisic within 1 game week when it came to game week 3. As far as clean sheet percentages, they're actually very high for Spurs. We talked about Conte's stats being so good in terms of how the defense has been under Conte. So I would expect Perisic to benefit greatly with these next few fixtures because Nottingham Forest, West Ham have been very, very poor when it comes to creating chances themselves. And when we look at a team like Fulham playing at home, that's a great match for Tottenham to play. As far as the additional notes, the most important thing about Perisic is whether he's rotation prone or not. So you have to stay tuned to Spurs journalists, predicted lineups, and try to stay in tune with whether Perisic will start because that does simply affect your game week very, very drastically. As far as Rodrigo, I don't think his minutes will change with Bamford coming back. The only thing is that penalties will be taken away from him. And because this Leeds team are so busy and so active with the press, I do find that they will advance into very interesting positions and potentially draw penalties. And with Bamford coming back, I do think that does take away from Rodrigo's kind of expected points ceiling. At the same time, though, Rodrigo's been fantastic so far, so I think his minutes will only improve as time comes, and we'll probably see more 85, 90-minute games from him because this Leeds team are so reliant on him being so confident and being so great as a frontline attacker. As far as Toney, he's a little bit more interesting because he doesn't have any of these drawbacks, and he's a penalty taker. But once again, it doesn't really make sense to go into Toney now, especially if you have 8.0 mids who still have great games, and it's really hard to move into Toney unless you'd like to go for a wild card. And that's pretty much what it comes down to with these assets. I think they're all fantastic. Next question is going to be what to do with Liverpool assets, especially since they've had such a terrible start to the season. One of the key things with Liverpool, I would say, is the defensive injuries have significantly impacted them, as well as the Darwin red card and the midfield injuries too. Thiago missing, Keita being unfit, Firmino playing consistent games has been really terrible for the team because you had to watch players like Milner and Firmino who definitely seem like they're off the mark and don't really match the physicality and the pace of the Premier League. As far as the defensive options, they've been very poor as well. I don't think Gomez had a particularly good game versus United, and we saw Nat Phillips have an equally poor game versus Wilfried Zaha when Crystal Palace were playing Liverpool at Anfield. And that simply calls into question whether you want to back the double Liverpool defense any further. I think the simple answer is versus Bournemouth, you absolutely have to stick with Robertson. It makes a lot of sense to play him in this fixture. Bournemouth have been one of the least offensive teams in the league, and I would say it makes the most sense to keep Robertson for this fixture and then actually just move away from Robertson in the week after that, because the Newcastle game is probably going to be a high goal scoring game once again, because we've seen this Newcastle team to be very confident and they have the players to conquer Liverpool in key positions. If you are holding Trent and Salah, I think there's absolutely no reason to move away from them. Ultimately, Liverpool's fixtures are still really good and they're still posting independently very good stats. Salah's expected numbers have actually dropped off compared to previous seasons, and part of that too, as I said, is because the midfield looks so weak compared to previous years. However, Trent's still posting fantastic numbers when it comes to expected goal involvements, and if you've been watching the games, he still looks like the creative attacking asset that we want to have in our teams, and I think he's still great value for money. However, I just can't really justify Robertson for now. As far as Luis Diaz, this actually fits perfectly with question number 5. The reason why I would be suggesting downgrading into players like Rodrigo and Zaha or even Gundogan, who's a little bit cheaper, is simply because the 8.0 mids haven't delivered. I don't think there's been a premium option so far who's conquered each game week or made them look really exciting on paper. Foden has had better minutes, but he's also had some pretty interesting blanks that I would say probably suggest KDB and Haaland are the better options. Even the defensive options from City might be more consistent over time, especially if you're holding Cancelo in your team. As far as Zaha and Rodrigo, though, they are the talismans currently of their present teams, and they do provide you a little bit more money to play with in the bank. And that might even allow you to move into a structure where maybe you'd go into someone like a KDB if Haaland is starting to be rotated. And that's kind of why I like downgrading from those assets such as Mount, Saka, and Diaz, especially if they don't do anything in game week 4. The key opportunity here is to assess what happens in the Brighton game. This is an interesting derby for Leeds because Brighton have been so good at home. As far as Zaha, another opportunity to see how he performs versus a big team. But the smooth run after that does suggest he's going to be a fantastic option, just like we saw in the Aston Villa game. And with Gundogan, once again, it calls into question how you want to structure your team, because it's very important to see how you actually spend your triple city assets and how you actually play around them. But that's it for today's top 5 questions for Game Week 4. Let me know how you guys thought about the series, and I'll look to improve week to week.